Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the past. When you imagine history, what do you see? Do you see it in black and white, like an old photograph? Or do you see it carved in cold, hard stone? We often think of history as something solid, unchanging, a set of facts written in permanent ink. But as we drift together tonight, I want to ask you, what if history is actually more like a dream? A collection of stories that have shifted, changed, and blurred as they passed from one sleeping mind to another. Welcome back to History for Sleepyheads. Tonight, we are opening the book for the third time to drift through the past's hidden truths. In our previous journeys, we peeled back the layers of time. We discovered that the Great Pyramids were raised not by the misery of slaves, but by the pride of skilled workers. We learned that the Vikings never wore horned helmets into battle, and that the Roman gladiator arenas were rarely the slaughterhouses movies would have us believe. But tonight, we go deeper. We are traveling into the forgotten corners of history to find the myths that still fool the experts. As you lie there, letting the tension of the day fade away, ask yourself, how many things do you know simply because you've heard them 1,000 times? Is it possible that the world is more colorful, more complex, and more human than we've been led to believe? We are going to unravel these knots, one by one. We will look at the white, the marble of Greece, the discovery of continents, and the words of presidents. So settle in, pull the covers up a little higher. Let the gentle waves of facts wash away the legends. You don't need to memorize anything tonight. You only need to listen and let the real stories lull you into a peaceful rest. Our first myth awaits us in the glow of the Renaissance. It is a story about perfection and how time can strip away the truth, leaving us with a beautiful but blank lie. Let's begin. Myth Number 1. The White Marble Lie, Greece and Rome. Imagine for a moment that you are walking through the quiet halls of a great museum. The air is cool and still. Your footsteps echo softly on the polished floor. You turn a corner, and there they stand, the gods and emperors of ancient Greece and Rome. They are breathtaking. Figures carved from pure white marble. They look ghostly, elegant, and restrained. We have been taught that this whiteness represents a kind of ancient perfection, a world of logic, purity, and clean lines. When you picture Julius Caesar or the goddess Athena, you picture them in this stark, colorless stone, don't you? But I have to tell you, this image of a white ancient world is a complete illusion. The idea that Greek and Roman statues were meant to be plain white is not just a minor misunderstanding. It is entirely false. If you could travel back in time to the Parthenon in Athens or the Forum in Rome, you wouldn't see a world of white. You would be overwhelmed by a riot of color. The ancients called it polychromy, many colors. Recent technology, using ultraviolet light and chemical analysis, has revealed the ghosts of the original paint on ancient statues. And these weren't subtle, pastel colors. They were vibrant, garish even. Imagine those stoic white statues you know so well. Now, paint the robes in deep crimson and electric blue. Paint the hair gold. Paint the skin in realistic flesh tones. Give the eyes brown irises and black pupils. Suddenly, the statue doesn't look like a piece of art. It seems like a real person frozen in time. It looks almost like a wax figure. So why do we think they were white? It is simply the tragedy of time. For centuries, these statues lay buried in the earth or stood exposed to the wind and rain. The organic pigments used for paint, made from plants and minerals, disintegrated or washed away. By the time they were dug up during the Renaissance, the paint was gone. Artists like Michelangelo saw the bare marble and thought, this must be how they wanted it. They fell in love with the accidental whiteness, and so, for 500 years, we have been copying a mistake, believing that the absence of color was a choice, when really it was just an accident of weather. Why does this matter to us tonight? Because stripping the color away strips the humanity away. When we see the ancients in plain white, they feel distant. They feel like a different species, cold, intellectual, and removed from us. But when you see the reconstructions, with their flushed cheeks, their patterned clothes, and their bright eyes, you realize they were just like us. They loved decoration. They loved showing off. They lived in a world that was loud, bright, and chaotic, not sterile and clean. It reminds us that history isn't a set of cold facts carved in stone. It was lived in color. As the bright colors of the ancient Mediterranean fade from your mind, let's travel forward in time and east across the globe. We arrive in India, standing before another monument famous for its white stone, the Taj Mahal. But here, the myth isn't about the stone's color. It is about the darkness supposedly following its creation. Myth number 2, the blinded builders, the Taj Mahal. Now let your mind drift to the banks of the Yamuna River in India. Rising out of the mist is the Taj Mahal. It is perhaps the most beautiful building in the world, a teardrop on the cheek of time, built by Emperor Shah Jahan for his favorite wife. But there is a dark shadow that hangs over this white marble wonder. You have probably heard the story. It is whispered by tour guides and repeated in history classes. The story goes that once the Taj Mahal was finished, the emperor was so possessed by its beauty that he made a horrific decree. To ensure that nothing so magnificent could ever be built again, he ordered the hands of the architects and craftsmen to be cut off or their eyes to be blinded. It is a story of ultimate jealousy and cruelty. It adds a tragic weight to the monument. But I am here to tell you, this story is entirely false. It is a dark fairy tale, nothing more. Where did this gruesome idea come from? Historians have searched through the extensive court chronicles of the Mughal Empire. The Mughals were meticulous record keepers. They wrote down everything: expenses, materials, and daily events. Yet, in all those thousands of pages, there is not a single mention of workers being blinded or maimed. Not only is there no evidence, but there is actually proof of the opposite. We know the names of the master architects and masons. The lead architect, Ustad Ahmad Lahori, didn't vanish into darkness after the Taj Mahal was completed in 1648. In fact, records show that years later, he was commissioned by the same emperor to lay the foundation for the Red Fort in Delhi. It is hard to design a massive fortress if you have no hands to draw with or eyes to see the plans. So why does the myth persist? It is likely an urban legend that started long after the emperor died. It falls into a category of folklore called the jealous patron. We tell this story not to record history, but to emphasize beauty. We are essentially saying, this building is so unique, so perfect, that the only explanation is that the creators were stopped from ever working again. Why is it essential to clear the emperor's name tonight? Because the myth turns a story of artistic triumph into a horror story. It suggests that great beauty requires great suffering. But the reality is much more inspiring. Enslaved people or victims didn't build the Taj Mahal. It was built by thousands of skilled artisans who were paid for their work, respected for their talent, and who went on to build other wonders. It was a feat of cooperation, engineering, and human skill, not the result of a tyrant's fear. We can admire the dome and the minarets without the guilt of a bloody legend. As the moon sets over India, we leave the old world behind. We are going to cross the vast open ocean now. We are sailing toward the coast of Mexico to a moment where two worlds collided. We are going to meet the Aztecs and uncover a misunderstanding that has lasted for 500 years. Myth number 3. The God Who Wasn't, Aztecs and Cortés. The year is 1519. The place is the coast of Mexico. From the ocean, strange floating mountains appear, Spanish ships with billowing white sails. A man steps onto the sand, Hernán Cortés. He is dressed in shining metal armor, riding a beast the locals have never seen, a horse. The story we are told is dramatic. We are told that the Aztec emperor, Montezuma, looked at this strange man and fell to his knees. We are told the Aztecs believed Cortés was the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, returning to reclaim his kingdom. We are told they surrendered because they were paralyzed by religious awe. It portrays the Aztecs as naive and superstitious, but this story is entirely false. The Aztecs did not think Cortés was a god. They knew exactly what he was, a man, a dangerous, strange man, but just a man. So where did the white god myth come from? The Aztecs didn't write it during the conquest. It was written by the Spanish, years later. When Cortés wrote letters back to the King of Spain, he needed to justify his actions. He needed to explain why he had taken over a sovereign empire. By claiming the Aztecs gave him the land because they thought he was divine, he made his conquest look legal. It was a convenient lie. The truth is much more political. When Montezuma welcomed Cortés into the great city of Tenochtitlan, he wasn't worshiping him. He was studying him. In Aztec culture, welcoming a potential enemy with gifts and feasting was a standard diplomatic ritual. It was a way to assess a threat without immediate violence. Montezuma gave Cortés the finery of the gods, not to say, "You are him," but to say, "Here is the costume of our deity. Wear it so we can see if you fit." It was a test. Furthermore, the myth relies on a mistranslation. The Aztecs used the word teotl to describe the Spanish. Later translators said this meant God, but in Aztec, teotl meant something more like powerful spirit or strange energy. They used the same word to describe the ocean or a wild animal. They were impressed by the Spanish technology, yes, but they did not worship them. Why does it matter if they thought he was a god or not? Because the myth attributes the Aztecs' mindset, loss of their empire, to their foolish belief in a deity. It suggests they were unable to distinguish between a man and a deity. The reality is that the Aztecs were sophisticated politicians. They lost the war not because of superstition, but because of smallpox, steel weapons, and the fact that Cortés made alliances with other native tribes who hated the Aztecs. When we remove the god myth, we see the Aztecs for who they really were, a complex civilization facing an alien invasion, trying to use diplomacy and strategy to survive. As the jungles of Mexico fade into the mist, we cross the Atlantic once more, returning to the heart of the ancient world. We're going back to Rome. We're gonna meet the most famous Roman of them all, a man whose name means emperor to us today, even though he never actually held the title. Myth number 4, the emperor who never was, Julius Caesar. Picture the most powerful man in ancient Rome. You see him standing in the Senate, wearing the purple-bordered toga. He commands legions. He conquers Gaul. His name is Julius Caesar. When we think of the word emperor, his face is usually the first one that comes to mind. We see him as the founder of the Roman Empire, the first in a long line of absolute rulers. But here is the surprise. Julius Caesar was never the emperor of Rome. If you had called him that to his face, he might have been offended. The title first emperor belongs to someone else entirely. So what was he? Technically, Julius Caesar lived and died within the Roman Republic. He was a general and a politician who accumulated massive power. Eventually, he forced the Senate to declare him dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. Now to us, dictator sounds just as bad as emperor. But to the Romans, there was a crucial legal difference. A dictator was an emergency role, meant to be temporary. By making it permanent, Caesar was breaking the rules while still pretending to work within the old system. He never wore a crown. In fact, he famously refused a crown when it was offered to him in public, to show he wasn't a king. The irony is that he was assassinated precisely because his enemies feared he might become a king. The actual first emperor was his great-nephew, Octavian, who later took the name Augustus. Augustus was the one who truly dismantled the Republic and created the imperial throne. He was the one who ruled as a monarch in everything but name. So why the confusion? Because Julius Caesar's name was so powerful that it became the title. Later emperors used Caesar as an honorific. It echoed through history, becoming Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia. Why does this distinction matter tonight? Because it shows us how fragile politics can be. Caesar was the bridge between two worlds. He was the storm that broke the Republic, but he didn't live to see the empire built on the ruins. It reminds us that history isn't always about clear starting lines. It's a messy transition. Caesar was the man who walked to the edge of the cliff, but Augustus was the one who built the castle at the bottom. As the marble halls of Rome fade into the twilight, we move forward nearly 2,000 years. We find ourselves in the early 20th century. The world is at war. We call it the Great War, believing it was a tragedy unlike anything humanity had ever seen before. But was it really the deadliest conflict the world had known up to that point? Myth number 5. The deadliest war, pre-World War II, World War I, the Great War. Looking back at the years between 1914 and 1918, we see the trenches. We see the mud. We see a generation of young men lost to machine guns and artillery. We are often taught that this was the moment the world lost its innocence. We believe that until 1914, humanity had never seen slaughter on such a massive industrial scale. We think it was the deadliest conflict in history up to that time. But this is a Western-centric illusion. While World War I was horrific, it was not the deadliest war of the 19th or early 20th century. A far deadlier conflict had already happened just a few decades earlier on the other side of the world. To find the truth, we must look to China in the mid-1800s. From 1850 to 1864, the Qing dynasty was shaken by the Taiping Rebellion, a massive civil war. It was a conflict of staggering proportions. A man named Hong Xiuquan, who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, led a rebellion to create a heavenly kingdom of great peace. The fighting lasted for 14 years. Entire cities were besieged and starved. The scale of death is almost impossible to comprehend. While World War I claimed roughly 15 to 20 million lives, estimates for the Taiping Rebellion range from 20 million up to 30 million, with some historians suggesting even higher numbers. It happened just 50 years before World War I. Yet in the West, it is barely a footnote in our history books. Why do we forget a tragedy of this size? It reveals a blind spot in how we view the past. We tend to focus on the history that happened in our own backyards. But history is global. Acknowledging the Taiping Rebellion doesn't diminish the tragedy of World War I, but it reminds us that the Great War wasn't the first time humanity faced an apocalypse. It humbles us. It reminds us that while Europe was building empires, millions of people in Asia were fighting for their own visions of the future, suffering in silence in our history books. The smoke of the battlefield clears, and we find ourselves in a much quieter place, a small room in Germany. Two brothers are sitting at a desk, surrounded by stacks of paper. They are writing down stories about wolves, witches, and glass coffins. You know them as the brothers Grimm, but did they really write the stories that bear their name? Myth number 6. The storytellers who didn't write, Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, in a cozy study in 19th century Germany, two brothers sat by a fire, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. When you hear their names, you think of magic. You think of Cinderella losing her slipper, Hansel and Gretel finding a candy house, and Snow White sleeping in glass. We imagine these two brothers as creative geniuses, inventing these dark and wonderful worlds from their own imaginations, penning the most famous fairy tales in history. But this image of the author is a fairy tale itself. The brothers Grimm did not write these stories. In fact, they didn't invent a single one of them. So, what were they doing? Jacob and Wilhelm were not fiction writers. They were academics. They were linguists and historians who were obsessed with preserving German culture. They realized that the old stories, the ones grandmothers told to grandchildren by the fireside, were disappearing. So, they set out on a mission. They didn't sit alone in a room inventing plots. Instead, they invited storytellers to their home. They listened to middle-class women, neighbors, and friends recite the tales they had heard growing up. The Grimms were essentially taking dictation. They were the first serious folklorists. The stories they collected, children's and household tales, were ancient. Some of them had roots stretching back thousands of years, passed down orally through generations. The Grimms simply caught them like butterflies and pinned them to the page before they flew away forever. They did edit them, of course. They made them more suitable for children, removing some of the darker or more scandalous elements. But the core of the stories, those belong to the people, not the brothers. Why does this distinction matter? Because it changes the ownership of our childhood dreams. These stories aren't the product of two men's minds. They are the collective dream of humanity. They represent the fears and hopes of countless forgotten ancestors. When you read a Grimm fairy tale, you aren't reading a novel. You are listening to a whisper from the deep past. You are hearing the voice of a peasant woman from the year 1300, echoing through the work of two brothers who knew the value of listening. As the whispers of the Black Forest fade, we hear the call of the open sea again. We are setting sail for the bottom of the world. We are looking for a massive continent, a great southern land. History tells us a British captain found it first, but the sands of the Australian coast tell a very different story. Myth number 7. The Late Arrival, Captain Cook and Australia. The year is 1770. The HMS Endeavour, commanded by Lieutenant James Cook, sails into a bay on the east coast of a vast, unknown land. He steps ashore at Botany Bay. He plants a flag. He claims the land for Great Britain. For generations, school books have taught a simple sentence: Captain Cook discovered Australia. It paints a picture of a lonely continent, entirely unknown to the outside world until the British arrived to put it on the map. But this is one of the most persistent myths in exploration history. Captain Cook was not the first. He wasn't even the second. He was incredibly late to the party. Let's look at the timeline. Cook arrived in 1770, but more than 160 years earlier, in 1606, a Dutch explorer named Willem Janszoon had already landed on the western side of the continent. Throughout the 1600s, Dutch sailors visited Australia repeatedly. They called it New Holland. They mapped thousands of miles of the coast. One explorer, Dirk Hartog, even left a pewter plate nailed to a post on an island in 1616 to prove he had been there. But it wasn't just Europeans. Long before the Dutch, fishermen from Makassar in modern-day Indonesia were sailing to the northern coasts of Australia. They came every year to harvest sea cucumbers. They traded with the indigenous people. They shared words, tools, and stories. And of course, the biggest truth of all. The indigenous Australians had discovered the continent at least 65,000 years earlier. They had thriving cultures, trade routes, and complex navigational knowledge long before a wooden ship ever appeared on the horizon. So why does Cook get all the credit? Because he was the one who stayed. The Dutch saw a dry, harsh land and decided it wasn't worth colonizing. Cook saw the greener East Coast and saw potential for an empire. The myth of discovery is really a myth about ownership. It erases the Dutch maps and the Macassan trade routes to make the British claim feel absolute. But tonight, we remember the full picture. We see a continent that was never truly lost, but was a busy crossroads of cultures long before the Endeavour dropped its anchor. We stay at sea for our next journey, but the stakes are even higher. We are attempting the ultimate feat, sailing completely around the world. We associate this triumph with one name, Ferdinand Magellan. But as we will see, the man famous for circling the globe never actually made it home. Myth number 8. The captain who never returned, Magellan. Imagine a single ship, battered by storms, limping back into a Spanish harbor in 1522. It is the Victoria. The crew is starving. Their clothes are rags. But they have done the impossible. They have sailed all the way around the world. When we think of this first circumnavigation, one name echoes through history: Ferdinand Magellan. We are taught that he was the first man to circle the globe. We picture him standing proudly on the deck as the ship returns home, the hero of the age. But there's a tragic flaw in this picture. Ferdinand Magellan never finished the voyage. In fact, he died halfway through the journey, thousands of miles from home. Magellan was the visionary. Yes, he organized the expedition. He found the passage through South America that bears his name, the Strait of Magellan. But his journey ended in the Philippines. He made a fatal mistake by getting involved in a local war between rival chieftains. On the beaches of Mactan, he was killed in battle. He never saw the Spice Islands. He never crossed the Indian Ocean. He never made it back to Spain. So who actually finished the trip? The credit belongs to a Basque navigator named Juan Sebastián Elcano. After Magellan's death, it was Elcano who took command of the surviving ship. It was Elcano who navigated the treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean and the African coast to bring the crew home. Yet, history has largely forgotten him. Magellan's name is on the maps, the galaxies, and the history books. Elcano is a footnote. There is even a theory that the first person to technically circumnavigate the globe was Magellan's slave, Enrique. He was from Southeast Asia, brought to Europe by Magellan years earlier. When the expedition returned to Southeast Asia, Enrique had effectively completed a full circle of the Earth, long before the Spanish sailors made it back to Europe. Why does this matter? Because it reminds us that exploration is rarely a solo act. We love the great man. Theory of history. One hero, one name. But the reality is a team effort, often finished by the people who don't get the glory. Magellan started the dream, but Elcano and the crew were the ones with the grit, to finish it. It teaches us to look past the headline and honor the survivors who actually crossed the finish line. From the vast oceans of the 16th century, we move to the dark skies of the 20th. We travel to 1940. Europe is falling to darkness. We are told a story of a lonely island standing against a tyrant. But was Britain really as alone as the history books say? Myth number 9. The myth of the lonely island, Britain and World War II. The year is 1940. France has fallen. The Nazis control the continent. The image is iconic. Great Britain, a small island nation, standing completely alone against the might of Hitler's war machine. We hear the speeches of Winston Churchill. We see the Spitfires defending the skies. It is a powerful story of solitary heroism. The darkest hour, where one country held the line for democracy while the rest of the world watched. It is a stirring story, but it is not the whole truth. Britain was never alone, not for a single day. To say so ignores millions of people who were fighting right alongside them from the very beginning. When Britain declared war, it wasn't just an island that went to battle. It was an empire. From the first moments of the conflict, resources and soldiers poured in from all over the globe. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and crucially, India. The Indian Army eventually became the largest volunteer army in history, with over 2.5 million men. In the skies over England during the Battle of Britain, it wasn't just British pilots. There were Polish squadrons, pilots who had escaped their occupied homeland and fought with a ferocity that stunned the British. There were Czechs, French, Belgians. The Polish 303 Squadron was actually the highest-scoring Hurricane Squadron in the entire battle. Without these exiles, the outcome might have been very different. And on the seas, the merchant navy was crewed by sailors from China, Africa, and the Caribbean, risking their lives to keep the supply lines open. Why does the alone myth persist? Because it is a good story. It creates a dramatic underdog narrative. It rallied the British people when they were frightened. But tonight, we widen the lens. We acknowledge that the fight against fascism was a global effort from day one. It wasn't just the story of a lonely island. It was the story of a world coming together. When we sleep tonight, we can remember the Polish pilots and the Indian soldiers who stood on the wall when the night was darkest. They deserve to be part of the memory. The noise of war fades. We jump forward to the Cold War. We are in Berlin. A young, charismatic American president is about to give a speech. He wants to say he is one with the people, but history tells us he made a delicious mistake instead. Myth number 10. The President and the Pastry. The date is June 26, 1963. President John F. Kennedy stands at a podium in West Berlin. The city is divided by a wall. The tension of the Cold War is thick in the air. Kennedy wants to deliver a message of solidarity, to tell the people of Berlin that he stands with them. He leans into the microphone and shouts the famous words, "Ich bin ein Berliner." For decades, people have chuckled at this moment. We are told that because of a tiny grammatical mistake, he didn't say, "I am a citizen of Berlin." We are told he actually said, "I am a jelly donut." It is a funny story. It paints the president as a clumsy tourist. But I have to tell you, this story is completely false. The crowd did not laugh. They cheered. They knew exactly what he meant. Where does the donut confusion come from? In some parts of Germany, a jelly-filled pastry is indeed called a Berliner. The myth suggests that by adding the word ein, meaning a, Kennedy changed the meaning from "I am of Berlin" to "I am a donut." But language is fluid. In Berlin itself, that pastry isn't even called a Berliner. It's called a Pfannkuchen. So the locals wouldn't have been confused at all. Furthermore, Kennedy was using the phrase figuratively. If he had said, "Ich bin Berliner," without the ein, it would have meant he was literally born in Berlin. By adding the ein, he was saying, "I am like a Berliner." Think of it this way. If I said, "I am a New Yorker," to show I love the city, you wouldn't think I was claiming to be a magazine. The myth that the crowd laughed at him didn't appear until the 1980s, nearly 20 years later. It was likely invented by a spy novelist or a comedian, and it stuck because we love the idea of powerful people making silly mistakes. Why do we correct this tonight? Because the truth is more powerful than the joke. That speech was one of the most important moments of the Cold War. It gave hope to a city surrounded by enemies. When we reduce it to a joke about a donut, we lose the bravery of the moment. Kennedy spoke perfect German for the context. He connected. And tonight, we can let the laughter fade and respect the words for what they really were. A promise of freedom. From the high stakes of the Cold War, we move to the strange world of Cold War business. We are going to talk about a soda company. A company that, according to legend, became the 6th largest military power in the world. It is the story of Pepsi and its Phantom Fleet. Myth number 11. The Cola Commander, Pepsi and the Soviet Navy. Picture a boardroom in the late 1980s. The executives of PepsiCo are sitting across from Soviet officials. They are trying to make a deal. The Soviets love Pepsi, but their money, the ruble, is worthless outside of Russia. They can't pay in cash. So, the story goes, they pay in warships. The headline is legendary. Pepsi owns 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. For a brief moment, we are told a soda company owned the 6th largest navy on the planet. It is a bizarre, funny image, a CEO commanding a fleet of warships. But like the donut, this story has been inflated. Pepsi never really had a navy. They never commanded a fleet, and they certainly weren't a military superpower. Here is the reality of the deal. It is true that the Soviets couldn't pay in cash. In the past, they had traded vodka, Stolichnaya, for Pepsi syrup. But Americans were drinking less vodka, and the Soviets wanted more soda. So in 1989, they did offer a fleet of ships, but these weren't active warships ready for battle. They were scrap metal. The submarines were old, rusted, and obsolete. They weren't even seaworthy. The Navy was essentially a floating junkyard. Pepsi didn't take possession of them to patrol the oceans. They acted as a middleman. The ships were immediately sold to a Norwegian shipyard to be broken down for scrap steel. Pepsi didn't want a navy. They wanted the value of the metal. The ships were towed away and melted down. The Pepsi Navy existed only on paper and only for the few days it took to sign the scrap contracts. Why do we love this myth? Because it highlights the absurdity of the era. It shows a world where capitalism and communism were colliding in strange ways. It is funny to imagine a soda company declaring war, but the truth reveals something more interesting. Human ingenuity. When money failed, people found a way to trade. They turned weapons of war into soft drinks. They turned submarines into scrap to buy a taste of the West. It wasn't a military victory. It was a victory of commerce. It was the rust of the old world being traded for the sugar of the new. The ships are gone. The soda is drunk. The history books are closed. We have traveled from the marble halls of Greece to the jungles of Mexico, from the trenches of war to the boardrooms of the 80s. Now it is time to rest. And so we close the book on another chapter of illusions. We have traveled far tonight. We have walked among the painted gods of Greece, seeing them not as cold stone, but as vibrant, living figures. We have sailed with the true explorers of Australia and the forgotten captains of the First World Voyage. We have stood in the trenches of forgotten wars and listened to the true words of presidents. From the marble of Rome to the rusted steel of a Soviet submarine, we have seen that history is rarely simple. It is not a straight line. It is a tapestry, woven with accidents, misunderstandings, and the beautiful complexity of human life. The myths we explored tonight, they melt away under the light of truth. But they don't leave us with nothing. They leave us with something better. They leave us with reality. And reality is a comfortable place to rest. It means we don't have to believe in monsters or perfect heroes. We can just believe in people. People who made mistakes. People who tried their best. People who lived and loved just like we do. You have journeyed far. Now it is time to let the past sleep. Let these truths settle in your mind. Let them push away the worries of today. You are safe here, in the quiet company of the real past. If you enjoyed this drift through history, and if you want to uncover more hidden truths with me, you know where to find us. We will be here, waiting with more stories for Part 4. For now, let the history books close. Let the dust settle. Sleep well, and sweet dreams in the real past.